A mixed bag. Japan's space agency JAXA confirms its robotic lander safely touched down on the moon's surface, but teams say the solar panels aren't drawing power, putting the future of the lander into question. What went wrong with the landing attempt of the slim spacecraft? Back from whence it came. Roughly 10 days after launching, a commercial lunar lander broke up in Earth's atmosphere after failing to reach the moon. What's next for NASA and its industry partners trying to kick off the commercial era of lunar exploration? Dragon soaring. SpaceX launched the third private astronaut mission bound for the International Space Station. The first all-European commercial crew is being led by the first astronaut to fly into SpaceX Dragon twice. And Artemis angst. NASA leadership defending the launch delays of the first crewed missions to the moon as part of the Artemis program on Capitol Hill. Lawmakers broadly supporting the program, but questions persist on how realistic a crewed landing in 2026 may be. Joining us for insight and analysis are Marcia Smith, founder and editor of Space Policy Online, and Loren Grush, author and space reporter for Bloomberg News. From the Spaceflight Now News Bureau at NASA's Kennedy Space Center, this is News from the Press Site.
And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together, back to the moon and beyond.
Copies.
On board the International Space Station.
And liftoff. Go Falcon, go Dragon, go Crew Dragon.
This allows us to go faster and to have better technology.
When we start putting humans on that vehicle, the excitement is even going to amp up even more.
Thanks for taking the time to answer our questions. Hello there, everyone, and welcome to News from the Press Site. I'm Will Robinson-Smith, reporter for Spaceflight Now. So good to be with you on another Friday, wrapping up a busy week yet again on the Space Beat. A bit of housekeeping at the top of our show here at News from the Press Site. We'll be monitoring the live chat throughout the broadcast. So if you have some questions or topics that you'd like to bring up during our social breaks coming up in a little bit, we'll be sure to look at them and we'd love to bring you in the conversation if you have something either for myself or for one of our two fantastic guests. So if you'd like to put in a comment, if you're one of our channel members, we'd love to hear from you, or the YouTube super chat if you'd like to support, but we'll be monitoring for other questions as well. And as I mentioned, yet another busy week that we are wrapping up coming here on January 19th. Lots of late hour lunar news today as well between Japan and the United States. We'll get to all of that in due time. But first, I want to introduce the wonderful folks I have joining me for this discussion. And as mentioned, insight and analysis. First up, we have Marcia Smith, who is the founder and editor of Space Policy Online. She has more than four decades of work in the realm of space policy. And she's also been thoroughly involved on the Space Beat in many facets, very busy up on the Hill. Marcia, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for inviting me. I'm looking forward to it.
Absolutely. And also we have Loren Grush. She is currently the space reporter over at Bloomberg News. But before she took on that role, she was over at The Verge working on the Space Beat there, doing a lot of great reporting. She's also the author of The Six, the book that chronicles the beginnings of the journey for six women, the first six that were the first women chosen for NASA's astronaut corps. It's a great read, available, as you can see in her shot there, both in paperback and hardback. I've got my hardback back there. It's a great read. Loren, welcome to the show and congrats.
Yay, thanks so much for having me. Excited to chat.
Absolutely. And, we've all been exceedingly busy, as I mentioned, with the lunar news that's been coming down the pipe today. A number of things that we could start with, but let's start at the top of the day, work our way down. It began with a historic landing on the moon. JAXA's SLIM lander, which is their robotic lander that was launched back late last year in September. It's been making its journey to the moon. Some very harrowing minutes as we were watching the telemetry data of it making its propulsive burns heading down to the moon's surface. Telemetry showed it touched down, but then there were some tense moments where they were saying they were reviewing the data and there was a lot unknown. We do know that it landed, but it's facing some hurdles. So I want to bring in the panel to go ahead and break it all down for us. Marcia, I want to start with you. It's, always exciting to see a new country added to the roster of those now in a very small club. Only 5 have actually managed to safely touch down on the moon's surface. For you watching that, data screen and just seeing the little slim lander icon make its way down, describe the morning for you and what was it like, witnessing this little piece of history?
Well, it's actually kind of amazing that we have so many lunar landers today that I was not only watching that landing, I was watching the clock because at 1 o'clock, Astrobotic was going to be having its press conference and you almost had dual press conference about lunar landers. So, there's a lot going on the moon these days, and congratulations to Japan for becoming the 5th country to successfully soft land. It's a shame that they have some problem with their solar panels. They didn't seem to know whether it was that it had fallen over or something, so the solar panels weren't pointing in the right direction, or if there was a hardware problem. But they're at least remaining somewhat optimistic that maybe as the sun angle changes over time, that maybe they'll get a little bit of sunshine on those solar cells. So we'll see what the long-term future is for SLIM, the smart lander for investigating moon. But they did soft land successfully. They did eject their 2 itty-bitty rovers, and they're communicating back to Earth. So I think it counts as a success.
Yeah, and Loren, obviously they've got a lot of data now to pour over to see, what they may be able to salvage from this mission. It's a little uncertain given that they're currently not able to charge their batteries. But it sounds like, as Marcia was alluding to, that they may be able to do some science, since it sounds like everything else besides the charging element is working right now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they said, a few hours left in the battery. And I think there was some hope that maybe when the sun changes position in the sky, perhaps that could help charge the battery. One of my favorite parts of the press conference, though, was they were talking about how they defined success. And they said they put it into 3 categories. There was minimum success, full success, and extra success. At least this was how it was translated because it was in Japanese. And they said that they achieved minimum success, and I think I'm going to use that term going forward when I do tasks, that I achieved minimum success. But I think it's still a huge accomplishment, and the fact that if they can still get data from the moon is pretty valuable. Obviously, if they had crashed, they would not have had that opportunity. So the fact that they soft landed is such a huge feat and not something we shouldn't take for granted.
Yeah, I think minimum success is going to enter a lot of our vocabulary from here on out. One of the things that jumped out at me, Marcia, and perhaps you as well, was the kind of demure manner with which they took this, historic milestone. And I believe it was the Director General of JAXA when it was posed this question of, you're the 5th country to land on the moon, almost that Super Bowl question, why aren't we not seeing this like big celebration from you? And he, was very sort of composed about the whole thing. Did it surprise you that they were sort of, I don't want to say necessarily downplaying it, but almost to that point where they're just like, yes, we landed, and here are the facts, and we can't fully celebrate because it wasn't a fully successful operation by all metrics. Was that surprising to you at all?
Well, it was. I don't know if it's a cultural difference or not, but here in the States, we're so accustomed to the SpaceX crowds cheering when anything good happens with the SpaceX mission. And, when we have successes and they show the mission control or the employees or whatever, everybody's out there and cheering and everything. And they all look very solemn, especially right after the landing. When, you could, on Twitter, X, you could see people like Scott Tilley saying, yeah, they're getting signal and everything. And so you wonder why they weren't more excited about it. So like I said, I don't know if it's just a cultural difference or if they don't want to try claiming success before they feel that they can do so.
And so, obviously we don't know exactly how long this mission will last if it's not, in fact, able to power on, its batteries and get those charged. But Loren, from this point, what are you kind of watching for with this mission as we mentioned, busy time on the moon, and we'll get to discussions of intuitive machines in just a moment. But, just talking about SLIM to, start to wrap up this part of our conversation, what are you kind of hoping to see, hoping to learn now at this point? I know they mentioned they'll have another update next week, right?
Yeah, well, I'd love to see, how the rovers operate. Obviously that, before we knew that it actually soft landed, we thought that maybe the lander might have crashed but the rovers had successfully deployed. So we were wondering if, how do you couch that? Is that success or failure or what? But so I'd love to see what the rovers, are able to achieve. And then also I think we're still waiting to learn if they did achieve that pinpoint landing that they were supposed to do. They seem to have confidence that they did, but they didn't quite confirm it during the press conference. So I'd love to know about that because, being able to, pick and choose exactly where you want to land on the moon is a huge capability and something that I think a lot of people would want to replicate and use in the future.
And I suppose now's as good a time as any to pivot from one realm of partial success to another realm of partial success, as we just got out of
Minimum
another
success.
update. Yes.
Minimum success.
Minimum success. I suppose that's how Astrobotic is kind of feeling right now. John Thornton, the CEO, certainly highlighting some of the high points of the Peregrine Mission 1, which for those who may not have been following super closely, just a quick recap. It was the robotic lander that launched on Vulcan's first flight back on January 8th from the Cape at very early 2:18 in the morning. Lots of us were very interested to see that launch. And within just a few hours, they both had access to the telemetry data, but then it was not too long thereafter that they started running into problems with the propulsion system. In a nutshell, it created a burst in one of the tanks on the oxidizer side. And at that point, it seemed pretty clear that a lunar landing was pretty much out of the picture. Fast forwarding through the rest of the saga, they went out to lunar distance, came back to the Earth, and the decision was made to let it have a re-entry where it splashed down in the South Pacific Ocean. So coming back to the panel here, Loren, I'll start with you on this one. Lots to take away from the saga that was the Peregrine 1 mission. I think for a lot of us that are in the news side of appreciating space was just getting to appreciate everything that was happening. As a lot of us mentioned in the briefing, Astrobotic was very transparent about this whole thing.
Yeah, I think that was, applauded during the press conference, which it very much should have been because, a lot of the times I think, at least when I'm used to reporting on failures, there's a reluctance to share exactly what's going on for fear of negative perception. But, for journalists, transparency is king, right? And so the fact that they were constantly sharing updates and telling us what was going on, I mean, I hate to say it, but it was kind of against the norm. Sometimes I feel like a lot of people like to hide that information. So it was really nice to be able to get those details in real time. Another thing I'll just add is that, going into the launch, everyone was very clear that failure could happen here. And I think that was a nice change of pace for a NASA program, obviously, or it wasn't a NASA program, but a NASA related program. Obviously when it comes to crew launches or, when people are involved, failure really is not an option. But, the fact that they are allowing, these kinds of failures and being open to the fact that they will happen, it's a bit of a change of pace for NASA. And I think it was great that they were just very clear that, if we fail, we failed and we'll learn from it. And so it's just a nice change of pace. And I hopefully that changes kind of the narrative about these failures. Obviously, there aren't zero consequences, but, they did build failure into this program going in. And so, I think they communicated that pretty well regarding the whole situation.
Yeah. And, Marcia, just to that point, obviously you've had a lot of experience on the Hill and some of the bureaucracy and red tape side of the whole space venture. From your perspective, a bit of fresh air as well, I'm sure, to, really get a lot of insight into this mission. And also, just during the press conference that just wrapped up, the amount of detail that John Thornton and the folks at Astrobotic were sharing there, and it sounds like we'll continue to share moving forward.
Well, I give them a lot of credit, not only for their transparency, but also for what I consider to be a really responsible decision to let Peregrine re-enter the Earth's atmosphere. Thornton talked about the consequences if they thought of staying in space and maybe getting back close to the moon, but if something went awry and the spacecraft exploded because of the problem with the oxidizer tank, it could have created debris. It creates a hazard. It's a hazard in cislunar space. And so they made the responsible decision, and I'm sure it was a very difficult one for them, to let their little spacecraft come back to Earth and re-enter through the atmosphere. So I think that they deserve a pat on the back for a very good space sustainability decision, in addition to their openness all along the way. I think they had 21 updates over these past few days about everything that was going on. So I really give them a big pat on the back. And I admired Thornton's whole attitude that he is emboldened by this. And it makes him even more confident that they're going to be successful the second time. Now, of course, the second time is the Viper rover that NASA is going to be sending. And that's a really expensive piece of hardware. It's $430 million or something. So I think they may have to, be sure they've not just crossed the T's and dotted the I's once, but 2 or 3 times. Make sure all those valves are going to work the next time, because there's going to be a lot more writing on the next mission. And I think, overall, this whole concept that Loren was talking about, that they've built failure into this whole CLPS strategy, the Commercial Lunar Payload Services strategy. And Jim Bridenstine and Thomas Zurbuchen, when they announced it back in 2018, they said it was taking shots on goal, 50-50 chance. And from an innovation standpoint, that's really great. But from a taxpayer money standpoint, I think there can be a limit to that. And for everybody who either remembers or has read history about the Dan Golden era at NASA and faster, better, cheaper, and how we were going to build less expensive Mars spacecraft and launch more of them. And if we had a few failures along the way, people wouldn't mind so much because they were going to be much less expensive than the really big ones that NASA had been launching before that. But there was a limit. There were 2 failures in a row, and then everybody sort of said, nah, this is not better. And so I think that you couldn't, maybe if you had one more CLPS failure, it would still be okay. But if you had one after another, I'm not sure how the people who pay for these programs, we taxpayers and our representatives in Congress, I'm not sure how they'd take that.
Yeah, I will say it kind of worked with this one, and I don't want to denigrate the payloads that were on this particular lander, but the stakes were a lot lower, right? There wasn't a very expensive rover. There weren't people involved. So, having a failure like this, I mean, it's still $108 million that NASA did invest in it. So again, not zero consequences, but the fact that NASA was able to allow failure in this program is such a novel thing for the agency.
Yeah, novel, and certainly many more shots on goal, as Marcia mentioned, left for this year potentially. I think the most assured one is Intuitive Machines, which all eyes now are on them for either success or failure with their Nova C lander. They haven't publicly released a launch date yet for that, but it'll be going up on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, landing about 5 or so days later. And given what's left potentially on the calendar, I'll throw this out to the both of you. Start with Marcia and then to Loren. Hard to look into a crystal ball for any of us, but just given sort of the trajectory, if you will, of the CLPS program, how are you both feeling about the prospect of IM-2 with Intuitive Machines, a Firefly, or potentially the Viper, making their launch and landings this year? Or does the whole CLPS program kind of take a step back and see, well, let's see what Nova 1 does first, or Nova C for IM-1 does, and then we'll kind of take it from there?
Well, even NASA was not willing today to put dates on any of these things. Joel Kearns just said, well, it's really up to the companies to say when they're going to launch, which is also sort of new for NASA. So that's all part of this whole CLPS strategy. But he said maybe 4 more this year. And so I don't have any inside knowledge as to whether or not those are realistic dates, but I do wonder about the Viper launch. As I said, right now, that's for November. And both Joel and John Thornton were sort of saying we need to wait to see what our anomaly investigation board has to say before we can really firm down that November date. But I think that probably one is going to be one of the ones that slips. But as for the two intuitive machine ones and the ones from Firefly, I don't know. Maybe they'll get off.
My kind of adage is always, when you see hardware, then it feels a little more real. I've seen the intuitive machines hardware. It does exist. So I do think that will launch in February, since it is at the Cape. I think it's at the Cape right now. I'm apologies in advance if Firefly has shown hardware. They might have. I haven't seen it yet. So I would say I would bet on one CLIPS launch this year. The others are a little iffy to me.
Yeah, I think it's
one more Eclipse launch.
Right. Yeah, no, I would agree that probably IM-1 is pretty darn secure now that the lander is here. The path to the pad is fairly clear. I think there may be one more Starlink launch that could go off from pad 39A. SpaceX is doing some refurbishment work on pad 40. But Intuitive Machines, I'm sure, is kind of chomping at the bit, saying, put me in, coach. We're ready to go. We want to prove our mettle, and it'll be an interesting mission to watch. And certainly much faster, since their path to the moon is not quite as circuitous as the Peregrine 1 mission was.
Yes, it'll be an even more chaotic time. I made a joke on Twitter X today that my heart can't take these lunar landings because they're so intense and they're happening more frequently, and so it just means more opportunities to be in big ambiguity about the state of a lunar lander.
Well, we'll put a pin in the CLIPS program for now, but want to pivot to a bit of reporting that I know, Marcia, you've certainly had your eye on this week, which is NASA on the Hill with the Artemis program. Obviously, we were watching and heard about the delays to both the Artemis 2 and 3 missions, the first that will feature crew on board. But Marcia, you were obviously intently listening to the NASA or the House subcommittee hearing on science and technology. What was kind of your biggest takeaway from both NASA's defense of the current Artemis timeline as it stands, and I guess let's start with the questions from the congressmen before we get to some of the rebuttals from the folks from GAO and the like.
Well, Congress on a bipartisan basis is very concerned about the United States staying ahead of China. And they see the Artemis program as part of U.S. leadership in the world, demonstrating that we're going to get back to the moon before China gets there. And that really is driving a lot of the congressional enthusiasm for Artemis. So Congress still has a lot of questions about the cost and the schedule and everything, but what they really want to do is to keep pressing on, because they know that China is out there. I think Congresswoman Lofgren said they were nipping at our heels or something like that. And so, that's really helping NASA, I think, in all of this, because the schedule's being delayed, the costs are going up, all the usual things that happen with space programs. And ordinarily, you might see Congress starting to push back, but I don't see them pushing back, at least in terms of their enthusiasm for the program. We still have to see what happens with appropriations. Where the rubber meets the road is how much money they're going to give, and that whole appropriations process is chaotic at the moment. But at least in terms of congressional support on a bipartisan basis, Artemis has got it. They had it and they still have it.
Yeah, and obviously the folks on the Hill are supporting Artemis. Loren, obviously there's been some reports about the concerns from other government agencies like the Government Accountability Office, which had its report last year, and then I believe they had a follow-up this month about their concerns about the timeline given the outstanding hardware that still needs to be developed. Obviously, one of the long poles in the tent is SpaceX's Starship. We were just talking before the stream about watching the first integrated flight test. They got a second one last year. We're looking potentially to the third one next month. Do you feel like that NASA sort of got this in a good pocket right now, or do you feel like, based on your watching of the whole Artemis adventure so far, that it may likely fall into what the GAO predicts, that we may see yet another slip given the potential lack of readiness for 2026 landing?
I'll just say that I've made some bets a few years ago on when we'll actually land on the moon, and It does not fall currently in line with the 2026 prediction. It's a little bit later than that. So no, I don't think the timeline that they have suggested is realistic. I don't think most people do. I think the issue, though, is NASA's in a tough position, right? Like they obviously have a lot of pressure from lawmakers because of this perceived race with China that they need to beat them. And, you know, they're nipping at the heels, like Marcia said, or Marcia quoted. But you know, NASA is also in the position of making the lawmakers happy in terms of, you know, supplying their districts with jobs and making sure these programs are well funded. And so I think that's why, you know, they want them to move quickly, but the architecture that they have just does not allow for that. But that's not how NASA is set up. You know, NASA is set up to you know, make various you know, they have to get money from lawmakers. And to do that, they have to, you know, have programs in their districts. And it just is not conducive to a very efficient architecture. So it's a tough position to be in because everyone wants them to be fast, but that's not how NASA is built up. It's not how the Artemis program is built up. But I don't think that's what Artemis is meant to achieve. It's meant to make everybody happy. And that doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be a fast moving program when it's like that. I don't know. I'm curious what Marcia thinks about that point, having been on the space policy side for so long.
Well, I think that, you know, one of the interesting things that Kathy Kerner said, and it followed on something Jim Free had said last summer, which was that if they can't make the deadline tear out all the stuff, and they're going to have to do all these retests because they're going to be moving connectors and everything. And so that's just an example of the surprises that you can get when you're getting closer to launch, even when you think you've gotten a piece of hardware that's gotten through the acceptance testing. So I do think 1 year between those two missions seems a little short to me.
I am curious why there is different acceptance levels for Artemis 2 and Artemis 3. You'd think they'd be the same, but you know, just an interesting point that I didn't get a chance to talk about. I also want to add that, and people can disagree with me here, that I feel like adding a very aggressive target date was maybe not the greatest idea for Artemis, especially if long-term sustainability was always the goal. I understand that politics were at play in that decision, but I think it was just something that NASA has constantly needed to ask, you know, account for, even though it was, I'm sure not. I mean, I think the original target dates for Artemis before, I think remember, it was 2024 that they were supposed to go back, and we pushed it to 2025, and now it's 2026. Obviously, there was a lot of politics in the 2024 decision, but the original target dates for Artemis, I think, were in the late 2020s, which were much more realistic. So it's a shame that they are constantly having to address this wild timeline when I don't think it was something that they were ever, you know, wanting to deal with in the first place.
Right, because it was going to be 2028.
Yeah.
When President Trump added the moon back into the plan, NASA came up with this thing for 2028. And it was only when Vice President Pence decided in 2019 to accelerate it that suddenly you had all this rush. And the idea was that, oh, well, you can rely on the private sector, and that's how we're going to get things done faster. But some things just take time, and you can't rush it if you want to be safe. And I think there is this debate about how safe is safe enough. And there's been some pushback I've seen on Twitter and everything about the repeated statements by NASA that we're only going to go in a safe manner. And there were some questions by one of the Congressman Issa from California during the hearing about whether or not NASA is trying to solve problems that have already been solved. But I think that the overall sense is that, yeah, you have to do everything you can to make sure these people are going to come back safely. And so if you want to do things safely and you want the highest probability that they're going to be able to return to their families, then it takes time. And that's just the reality of it.
Yeah. Unlike,
yeah, I mean, you want to go
Yeah.
safely, but sorry, Loren, go ahead.
I was just getting, unlike CLIPS, those were the lower stakes where you can have a failure. There's absolutely no room for failure, at least politically, geopolitically, you know.
Ethically.
Yeah, ethically. Well, I'm just saying NASA would be completely, you know, their astronauts may go, you know, they might accept that risk, but I don't think the nation or the world will let NASA accept that, you know, a lower chance of survival. That's just not acceptable to us.
Well, and especially with the U.S. leading the way in the Artemis Accords, you know, we want to set a good standard for these missions, especially if we are, you know, going to be caretaking for other nations' astronauts, which obviously we are with Canada on this first crewed flight with Artemis 2. And, you know, we'll see who we bring aboard for Artemis 3 when that actually does get announced. Want to close out this by going back to a point that, Marcia, you were making about, you know, needing to make sure that the budget's there and the financing behind all these initiatives to meet the timelines. Given that we're still in continuing resolution land with the latest CR kicking the deadline again to, I believe it's early March. You would know the date better than I. But how much of a pincer does this put NASA and its contractors in to not have any type of stability from a budgetary sense? You know, not to say anything else of the other, you know, programs that are, you know, watching for a real NASA budget to come out of this process, but specifically for Artemis, how much of a just sort of, you know, a nervous, you know, point does this make for them?
Well, I think it's a real big problem, and you need to know what kind of funding you're going to get in the out years. And Congress really doesn't look so much into the out years. Congress is a 2-year period of time, and they appropriate 1 year at a time. And even though the budgets come up to them and they have these out year projections in them, Congress really isn't thinking that way. They're thinking, you know, what do we have to do to get a budget passed for this year? And that's a problem for any research and development agency, NASA, DoD, Department of Energy, whatever. And I think it's a particular problem for something like Artemis, where you really need to know the cadence of when things need to get done and the money that's going to be available to pay the contractors. So I see these CRs as a huge impediment to getting Artemis done, and part of what almost inevitably is going to lead to more delays in the program, maybe not Artemis 2, but Artemis 3. And there was an interesting discussion about it at the hearing. And one of the members asked, I think it was Kathy Kerner, you know, what does all this uncertainty mean? And she answered the question. But Mike Griffin, who was another witness there, said, you know, it's okay if you have a flat budget, as long as you know you're going to have a flat budget, because then you can plan for it. The problem is the lack of consistency and lack of knowing when you're going to be getting the money. That's the big problem.
Yeah, the unknown unknowns, I suppose, when it comes to a budget are real, just, you know, kicking the pants for the Artemis program. But hopefully they're able to soldier through it, and you know, we'll get to these crewed missions sooner rather than later. Want to go ahead and take a beat from talking about the news discussion. We do have a viewer comment that wanted to bring up. This one actually is directed towards Loren. This comes from Gerald F., who asks, what is your opinion of Gwen Shotwell, who's the COO of SpaceX, for those not in the know, as well as having Kathy Leaders as the GM of Starbase, and all the women at SpaceX literally taking us back to the moon and Mars? And I feel like this question is very well pivoted towards you as the author of The Six, talking about the first 6 female astronauts. So go ahead, I'll let you run with that.
I love that we have, you know, Marcia, who's one. Oh,
I have mine too.
You guys are the best. Thank you so much. Obviously, a huge champion of women in space, of course. And, my opinion of Gwen is that she's basically running SpaceX. So that's something to be commended. And Kathy, I was actually just remarking the other day how, the NASA to SpaceX pipeline is kind of, fully in force. Gerstenmaier first was an associate administrator, and he moved over to SpaceX, and then Kathy was also in the similar, almost the same job and did the same kind of move. So definitely an interesting pattern. And then, yeah, I guess my opinion of Gwen is that, when it comes to making news about SpaceX, she is the one that I kind of turn to. Obviously Elon gets most of the attention because he's very boisterous and loud on his social channels. But we don't hear from Gwen very often. But when we do hear from Gwen, she is definitely making very big news. I think to last year at the FAA Commercial Space Transportation Conference, we got to talk to her, and she was, she gave us a lot of really big updates on the company. So I think that just goes to show that, she's running the show. And so, when she speaks, we definitely listen.
Yeah, you mentioned the NASA to SpaceX pipeline. Obviously, we just saw the retirement of Bob Cabana. So, be very interested to see if he stays retired.
Yeah.
Wanted to throw that question to you as well, Marcia, just about the importance of the achievement of a lot of great women who have, come from the NASA world, as well as just, operating on their own accord out in the commercial sector, given the, amount of time that you've spent covering the space beat, what's, I guess, if you can kind of encapsulate this moment in time that we're at this really important pivot in the space paradigm.
Well, I do think there's been a big change over the many decades that I've been doing space, and it's a welcome change. And it's interesting to see that now that Kathy Kerner is running ESDMD, the Exploration Systems Development Mission Directorate at NASA. So, and of course, Pam Melroy is the Deputy Administrator. So I think it's great that there are so many women that are rising up through the aerospace ranks. It was one of the parts of the industry, I think, that was furthest behind in recognizing the achievements of women and moving them up into the higher positions of authority. So I just think it's terrific.
Do want to bring up another comment from our live chat here. This one coming from T. Brookie, who says, there's a reason we have not been back talking about the Artemis program. She says, we are so risk adverse that we get outdated, safe Space Launch System rocket, too underpowered, but made with shuttle technology. I'll start with you, Marcia, and then go to Loren. Obviously, there's a number of components that harken back to shuttle era technology. Obviously, the 4 Rs-25 engines on the SLS are literally reflown from the shuttle era. The solid rocket boosters are an upgraded version of the ones that flew on shuttle as well. Do you feel like NASA and its commercial partners to that part of the Artemis architecture are, as T. Brookie was saying, playing it too safe, or do you feel like there's enough new within the Artemis program writ large, be it the actual rocket itself, adding in the HLS program, the commercial spacesuits, to really differentiate it from both Apollo and shuttle and let it stand on its own in a hopefully successful way?
Well, I think there are different ways of looking at it. If you look back to how did we end up with the Space Launch System, that was driven by Congress, not by NASA. So looking back to 2010, President Obama came in and he had an expert commission, the Augustine Commission, give him options about what to do with the Moon to Mars program. And the bottom line was that NASA was going to need $3 billion a year more to meet the goal at that time, was to get people back on the moon by 2020. And so President Obama wanted to cancel Constellation and move on. And he actually said we didn't need to go back to the moon. We're just going to go to Mars in the 2030s. But Congress, which represents the workforce, all these people who were working on the shuttle were going to transition to the Constellation program. And so they had nowhere to go. So Congress came through. Bill Nelson and K. Bailey Hutchinson, both in the Senate at the time, were the ones who came up with the NASA Authorization Act that said, no, you're going to build a big new rocket. And it's the space shuttle. It's the space launch system derived from the space shuttle. So I think that a lot of the connection between SLS and the shuttle came from the fact that we were closing down the shuttle in order to invest in this new system. So you can look at it, it was like a workforce issue. You wanted to make sure these people had jobs to go to, or you can look at it as you'd already invested all that money in developing these systems and they were fine for doing what you wanted to do next, to go back to the moon. So why not take advantage of the investment that you'd already made?
I think I'd go back to my point that I was saying earlier about what Artemis is meant to do. Obviously, the goal of Artemis is to land the first woman and the first person of color on the surface of the moon. But I think in terms of how NASA needs to satisfy, the people that fund the agency, Artemis also satisfies those components. Like, as Marcia was saying, there were a lot of contracts that were already in place because of the shuttle program. And it was not politically favorable to just end them cold turkey. And so that is why we ultimately have the SLS program. And that's because there are various lawmakers throughout the country that have a vested interest in those contracts and keeping the people in their districts employed. And, they wanted to keep those going, and they also fund NASA. So there is this kind of catch-22 situation where they have to keep those people happy. It may not always be the most efficient or up-to-date architecture, but that's not how NASA works. NASA works because it is a taxpayer-funded agency that, is in a democracy. I feel like we could talk about this for like a full hour. But also think of it this way. There was no universe in which NASA was just going to destroy SLS, destroy Orion, and give all their funding to SpaceX. That's just not politically favorable, which I think a lot of people want them to do because, they see Starship and the fact that it's a rocket that can launch on its own and doesn't need all of these other pieces of hardware. But politically, that was just a non-starter. With Artemis, there's kind of this marriage of these two systems where NASA is able to satisfy the people that are funding the agency, but also has extra money to invest in SpaceX and these other newer technologies, these vertically integrated companies. So I think it it's not necessarily the most efficient system, but I don't think NASA is set up to be the most efficient system. And they're able to get kind of the best of both worlds of the way that they've done it. So that's ultimately my opinion on that. But I'm welcome to other thoughts and opinions as well.
Yeah, no, I would generally agree that, it's, having been a reporter in the state of Alabama for the better part of a decade and seeing the impact of the Artemis program, not only in the Huntsville area where Marshall Space Flight Center is, but certainly, all the way down to Mobile, where they are in the throes of Mardi Gras season, if you'll pardon the pun, very much keeping track of and watching and, encouraging their young people to participate in STEM, in no short part because of the impact of the Artemis pipeline and the jobs that inspire. And that's just the tale of one state. So I think your point is quite salient, Loren, as well as Marcia. Given that we are Spaceflight Now, though, we would be remiss if we let the hour go by before we talk about all of the orbital launches that we've had in this past week. So we'll do a quick rundown of those, and then we'll bring our panel back to discuss any of those that jump out at them, although I imagine we'll have the most to say about the last one that launched just yesterday. Starting up with this one, we began the last week with Starlink 7-10. This was the launch of 22 Starlink V2 mini satellites on a Falcon 9 rocket that went up from Vandenberg Space Force Base, heading up to low Earth orbit. Coming over here on the Space Coast, we had the Starlink 6-37 mission. That was 23 Starlink V2 minis that launched on January 15th at 0152 UTC from Cape Canaveral Space Force Station. As mentioned earlier, that workhorse pad is going through refurbishment right now, as is some of the drone ships and the recovery vessels that SpaceX uses to scoop up the fairing halves. So it'll be just a beat before we see that launch pad back in action. But not too much longer given SpaceX's high ambitions, I'll say, to reach 144 to 150 launches by the end of the year. Moving right along, launch number 3, we had a Long March 7 from China. This was the Tianzhou 7 mission. It's a cargo resupply run similar to our commercial resupply services missions that SpaceX and Northrop Grumman conduct to our International Space Station. It launched on January 17th at 1427 UTC and has now rendezvoused with their space station. And last but certainly not least, probably the most headline-grabbing launch that we had this past week, of course, was the one we had yesterday from NASA's Kennedy Space Center, the launch of the Axiom 3 mission chartered by Axiom Space based in Houston, Texas, sent 4 astronauts up to the International Space Station where they will dock early tomorrow morning, early Saturday morning if you're watching this on a video replay later on YouTube. But they will spend about 14 days on orbit before they splash down off the coast of Florida. So there's your rocket rundown for this past week. Lots to potentially unpack, but I'll bring back in our panel to discuss. Loren, I'll start with you, and then we'll go to Marcia. I imagine I know which launch stood out to you this week, but just to not assume anything, what did you take away from this week in launches?
Yes, I think I was just happy that Axiom's 3rd mission took place during normal working hours, because that is not always we don't always have that benefit when it comes to these kinds of launches, especially to the International Space Station, because those windows are constantly changing. But the fact that it was at normal business hours was nice for me. I'll admit, one of the luxuries of my my new position is that I don't necessarily have to watch all of the Starlink launches. And I think I commend people who do, because they're happening very frequently. So the people who are still keeping tabs on Starlink, I very much commend you, but I may have dropped off that level of attention since they've happened all the time now.
Well, I guess to that point, we'll come back to AX3 in a moment, Marcia, but we're not quite at the point where rocket launches are as common as airline flights, but certainly it's becoming a lot to keep up with for all of us here on the space beat, but certainly the lay person. What are your impressions, I guess, of sort of where we are in this launch landscape, especially given that just SpaceX on their own is hoping to get as Elon says, up to 150 launches potentially this year?
Well, you're right that we're not quite up to the cadence of airline flights, but it feels like it for those of us in the space business, because I can't remember a time when there have been so many launches, one after another. And like Loren, I commend all of you who keep track of all of them, because I just can't. It's too many. And that's just here in the States. Then that's all the Chinese launches. They've got quite a rapid pace. The Russian pace has dropped off quite a bit, and the European pace has dropped off quite a bit, but hopefully they're going to start picking back up again pretty soon. But it is really impressive how much is being launched. I do worry a little bit about the space sustainability part of all this and all of those constellations, the mega constellations. Right now it's Starlink, but Kuiper is going to be coming along, and there's OneWeb and everything. And I do wonder, who is it that, other than people who do space sustainability, as a passion or as a living, who is it that's paying attention to what all of this means to the long-term sustainability space? Because we're not going to be going anywhere if we have like 40 or 50 colas we have to do just trying to get out of Earth orbit, trying to get to the moon or go to Mars or wherever. So, it's wonderful to see the launch cadence. It's a very busy time. It shows that the space industry is very healthy. It helps demonstrate the value of space to people here on Earth. Why do we need space? Because we need to have internet connections and Earth observation satellites and all of that. So there is absolutely an upside, but I do think that there is, not red flags out there, but sort of yellow flags maybe about what we're doing to Earth orbit. And maybe we should pay attention as we go out into cislunar space and lunar orbit, where, by the way, the moon does not have an atmosphere where you can re-enter satellites into and get rid of them very easily. So I think
point. Yeah.
I keep wondering what they're going to do with all the trash, from the Gateway Space Station. They just push it out the airlock or whatever, put it in a Progress or whatever to re-enter it in Earth's atmosphere, but you can't do that at the moon. So what is the trash disposal strategy for lunar exploration and cislunar space? And again, that's why I give Astrobotic an extra pat on the back for doing the responsible thing with Peregrine.
I think also just to add, one thing that's so wild about the space industry, at least covering the space industry, is that, the innovation happens more quickly than I think we know how to quantify the repercussions of it. SpaceX continues to launch and more satellites are being put up and we're pushing towards cislunar space, but we don't quite know what impact. I mean, we can guess the impact, but we're kind of watching it play out in real time. And it's very interesting as a reporter to be covering during this time because we're watching the repercussions happen in real time. And I don't know many other industries quite like that, to be honest.
It is a breakneck pace, and certainly, come back to the AX-3 mission, we're already on the third private astronaut mission, the first time that we've had, as they said in the SpaceX broadcast, a frequent flyer into the Dragon Club, with Michael Lopez Alegria being the first person to fly a Dragon twice now. And both he and Peggy Whitson will keep toggling back and forth, as they said, until they bring someone new aboard to command these missions, as they need a former NASA astronaut to do that on the public side, or on the private side, I should say. But I guess just to put a pin on this, Marcia, and then to you, Loren, on the commercial side of the space venture, what are you most looking forward to with this coming year, given that we have another one of these private astronaut missions? We still have, the rest of AX-3 to go through, but we also have, potentially, if they have the EVA suits ready, the Polaris Dawn mission, which will be a very exciting free flyer.
Yes, I think that is going to be quite a milestone when you have a non-professional astronaut doing a spacewalk, and we'll have to see how that goes, and never count your chickens before they hatch. So I think that's interesting. And, we were talking about astronauts getting back to the moon. And of course, there may be private astronauts going to the moon. If Starship can land NASA astronauts, it can land other astronauts. It already has contracts with Yusako Maezawa from Japan, and with Dennis Tito and his wife for circumlunar trips on Starship. So I wouldn't be surprised if private astronaut missions landing on the moon, maybe within a decade or so. I'm not sure. Elon Musk thinks he's going to be landing on Mars in 8 years. I don't find that to be very realistic. But I think there's a lot going on with private astronauts. When we were talking about safety and in terms of the public perception of NASA and how you have to be safe. And I wonder if the public mood is going to be the same when they're private astronauts. Is there going to be an expectation that the private sector is just as careful and safe about flights to the moon or Mars as NASA is? I think that's something that's still up in the air. But there's a lot going on with private astronauts. I'm very interested in the flights by Marcus Want, and there's going to be someone from Poland, where these are governments that belong to ESA, but they're so anxious to get their astronauts up there. They don't want to wait for the regular cadence from NASA, so they're actually paying extra in order to get their astronauts up there. There's not quite private astronauts. They're sort of commercial astronauts. I don't know how to categorize these folks. But it's interesting to me that all these many years that we've had human spaceflight, it is still so attractive to governments that, Turkey, I don't know what its total budget is, but it's willing to invest money to have their first Turkish astronaut. It's still so important to have that. I think, both for national pride and for, as everybody says, inspiring younger generations to do these bold things.
Loren, I'll give the last word to you.
Yeah, in terms of what I'm looking forward to, obviously everything that Marcia described, the private astronaut missions. One thing I'll note is there probably is something on the calendar there will be something on the calendar that's not there right now. If you remember, Inspiration 4 was announced early in the year and it was completed later that year. So I think it took place the entirety of my book leave. I didn't even cover that mission because I was gone for 9 months, and it was conceived of and executed within 9 months, which was kind of wild to think about. So maybe there's something that'll pop up next week that will be achieved sometime this year. And then definitely Starship development. I'm very eager to see that progress. Obviously, I've talked about this, I've reported on it a few times. you know, the laundry list that they have to do in order to become a deep space vehicle. You know, getting to orbit is just the beginning. There's so much more that has to be accomplished. So I'm very eager to see progression towards you know, in space cryogenic fuel transfer. There's supposed to be a small demonstration perhaps on the next flight. I don't think we quite got a solid answer on that. So, and it wouldn't even be, you know, starships tanking in orbit. It would just be some kind of small transfer on the vehicle itself. And then we also finally got an answer at a recent press conference of how many trips it might take to fuel Starship to get to the moon. 10-ish. I like that. Very vague, but a really great engineering answer. But yeah, those, I think people might maybe underestimate just how much there needs to be accomplished in order for Starship to be a lunar landing system. And so I'm very curious to see progress being made on those fronts, not just reaching orbit, but doing all of these other tasks that it'll be needed to be a deep space vehicle.
I will give Bill Harwood with CBS News and NASA Administrator Bill Nelson for you know, being able to get that answer out of SpaceX for the benefit of all of us to know that answer. Unfortunately,
Yes,
we've somehow already yes. Well, somehow an hour has already flown by, so we're going to have to wrap it up now. But before we go, want to give each of you the chance to let folks know where to follow your work, and in about 15 or 30 seconds or so, what you got your eye on this upcoming week. Loren, and then to Marcia.
You can follow me on Bloomberg.com, and also I'm Loren Grush on Twitter X. Also, I'm on Threads, so it's my Instagram handle, which is Grush Crush. Don't judge me for it. And then next week, I think we have a full day of Crew 8 briefings that I'm looking forward to. But honestly, I'm actually I want to hear Marcia's answer on this, because Marcia curates the best in space calendar in the biz, and so when it comes to knowing what's up next week, I defer to her, to be honest.
It is a must read, Marcia.
Well, you can find me at spacepolicyonline.com, and I do have a calendar, but I gotta be honest, I've been so focused just on getting through today that I have not looked ahead to what's coming up next week. I'm sure it's gonna be another full week, another exciting week. And yes, we've got the Crew 8 briefings, and Jeanette Epps is finally going to get her flight, and good for her. She's been waiting a long time for this, so hooray.
Yes, very excited to hear from her and from the rest of the Crew 8 astronauts, as well as, of course, the lone cosmonaut that will be flying on board with them as well. So our thanks to both of you. Marcia, Loren, thanks for spending part of your Friday with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for inviting me.
And, you know, as we close things out here from News on the Press site, want to thank our team that helped bring the show together. Of course, our Adam Bernstein, normally busy managing the tracking cameras and getting launch photography, but instead he's been running the technical board today, as well as our editor, Stephen Young, helping out with the technical aspects of this broadcast as well. And most importantly, want to thank you at home for watching and for participating in what was a very excellent discussion on a lot of different topics. Of course, we'll be back next week with more news from the press site, lots to discuss, lots to learn, and we look forward to seeing you for everything in between. So for all of us here at Spaceflight Now, and for our guests, Loren and Marcia, thanks to them for joining us. We'll see you next time at Astra.